I had asked how large the blood stain was, and I was told that it was larger than the cotton swab.
How large what blood stain was?
On the gate.
Did you ever ask how much of that blood stain had been removed and put on whatever you got it on?
No.
Now, did you get it on a swab or on a swatch?
It was a very small swatch.
Did you ever ask how many other swatches had been made from that blood drop?
No, I did not. I didn't feel it was necessary. When I looked at that blood swatch, I could see that it was thoroughly saturated with blood, and that was my concern.
Do you have a spectrophotometer in your lab?
Yes.
Is that an acceptable means of determining how much you might have of blood in a solution?
Well, it's an acceptable mean, I think, of determining how much hemoglobin is present, and from that you could possibly calculate how much blood was present.
Did you use any method at all other than just looking at it to try and tell how much blood was in the swatch?
Yes.
What?
I did a visual examination also of the extract after I extracted the blood with the water, and I got a very intense red color, which indicated to me that it was concentrated blood. And also I did a testing to prove that it was, or to indicate that it was blood.
The testing that you did, does that establish quantity at all?
Well, I think it does somewhat. I mean, I could visually see the blood on the swatch, and I could visually see the color of the extract that I performed.
Agent Martz, is it your testimony that you can tell with any precision how much blood is in a solution by looking at it?
For this particular case, I think that it is, because EDTA in preserved blood is at least 1,000 parts per million. If it is present in humans at a part per million, which we've not established, that is a 1,000-fold difference. And I don't believe that any technique that I could have used could have been off by 1,000%. I mean, I didn't need to be that accurate in order to determine whether or not the blood stains were from preserved blood or from non-preserved blood. I was very, very careful in the sizes that I cut. And I always made sure that I took more samples from the question samples than the control samples that I prepared. I very carefully looked at the color as I extracted, and I was convinced that I had at least as much blood on the control areas as I did on the question areas, or as on the, I had at least as much on the question areas as I did on the control areas. I was very, very careful in this analysis.
Did I understand you to say that you weren't concerned with the quantity of blood that you got on the swatch?
I was concerned with the quantity. I wanted to make sure that I had at least as much blood on the questioned areas as I did on the control areas, and I was convinced that I did. I was concerned, but even if there was a mistake of 1, 2, 50, 100%, I mean, I would still be able to answer the question whether it was from preserved blood or non-preserved blood. I was concerned. Yes, I was concerned.
Did you perform any tests other than just looking at it that was designed to find out how much blood was in the swatch that you started with?
I did a presumptive test on the blood, and I got similar colors, which would indicate I had similar concentrations of blood.
What presumptive test did you use?
I used the phenolphthalein.
Is that considered a quantitative test for blood?
Well, not necessarily, but I mean, you do have a color reaction, just like you have a color of blood. And everything I did to make sure that I had at least as much blood on the questioned areas as I did on the control areas.
Now, the stain from the sock, did you do any kind of testing on that other than looking at it to determine how much blood you got from the sock?
As I mentioned earlier, yes, I did other tests.
Anything other than you already told us?
No.
Did you examine the swatch material that you got on the back gate under the microscope?
No, I did not.
The samples that you prepared, your known samples from the reference tubes that we looked at, where did you get the swatches to do this?
Well, on the sock, I actually cut a piece off of the sock because I wanted to use the same type of material. So what I had was a blood stain on the sock, so I took the person's blood that was...
Agent Martz, the question was from the reference tubes. Where did you get the swatches to do this, not the sock?
Well, that's the answer, Your Honor. I took the sock. That's what I used.
Okay, for the sock reference. How about for the gate reference? What'd you use?
Well, as I was explaining, I wanted to try to make things equal. So for the stain that I produced for the sock, I took a piece of the sock. I took some of the blood of Nicole Brown, which was the one suspected or the one identified as being on the sock. I placed blood onto that sock. I let it dry naturally.
All right, Agent Martz, the question was, what did you do to prepare the sample for the gate? Not the sock, the
Okay.
gate.
For the gate, I took a similar type of cotton swatch in the laboratory and placed blood onto that swatch.
Now, you didn't use a swatch that came from LAPD?
No, it was too small. In order to put a blood stain onto a fabric and let it dry naturally, I was using 10 microliters of blood. I needed a certain size swatch. The size that they submitted to me was not large enough to do that particular test.
Is it your opinion that the amount of blood in a swatch is not determined by the kind of swatch? Well, let me rephrase that. Is it your opinion that if you used a swatch, let's say that had 4 layers of gauze rather than 2, that it's still going to hold the same amount of blood?
I tried to use the same type of swatch that was used in the particular case is all I can say. Whether it's 2 or 4 layers, it would make a difference as to how much it would absorb.
Agent Martz, did you ever examine the swatch you got from LAPD to determine, under the microscope, what kind of a swatch it was? How many layers were there?
No, I did not.
Did you ever look at your own swatch that you got from your lab to determine how many layers were in that swatch?
No, I did not.
Now, you recall, well, let me ask you this. Your eyeball estimate, or the way that you did this, what was your estimate of how much blood was on the gate swatch?
I did not estimate the amount of blood on that. What I did was to take a swatch of the same amount and prepared it similarly. I did not attempt to determine how much blood was on the swatch, except for the fact that the swatch appeared to be saturated with blood.
So then you made no effort to determine how much blood was there.
Well, visually I looked at it and the swatch was saturated with blood. Like if you were bleeding and would put something to it, it would absorb the blood. The swatch absorbed the blood. It appeared to be saturated with blood.
You remember me asking that question when we visited together in Washington?
Not specifically. I'm sure you did, but I can't remember specifically my answer.
You remember telling me that you estimated the amount of blood from the back gate as 2 microliters.
I can't remember that, but it would be at least, I'd say it was somewhere between 2 and 5 microliters would be my best guesstimate.
You remember me asking the same question about how much blood was on the sock stain that you cut?
I think I may have answered that. Was it 100 microliters, 200 I can't remember what I
It's
said.
50 microliters.
50 microliters.
How much blood is there in a drop? How many microliters?
Oh, I don't know. I don't do a lot of volumes with blood. All I know is I used 10 microliters or 5 microliters and created some stains.
Let's assume hypothetically that 50 microliters of blood is 1 to 2 drops. You have that assumption in mind?
Okay.
Your opinion that there was 1 to 2 drops of blood on the cutting from the sock that you took?
Not that I took. I'm talking about the whole area of the sock that was stained, probably 50 microliters. The area that I took was probably a couple of microliters.
So when you told me 50 microliters on that cutting, you misunderstood what I was asking?
Yeah, I was talking about the full stain.
Now, when you came up with a process that you used to extract the blood and EDTA, if there is any EDTA, from the swatch, correct, and from the sock cutting.
Yes.
What method was that?
EDTA and blood are both very soluble in water, so I extracted the materials with 25 microliters of water, let them sit for approximately 40-45 minutes, and they were in a tube which is designed to filter out a lot of the components of blood, to clean up the extract a little bit, because blood contains a lot of chemicals. And then I centrifuged it for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and the liquid passed through the filter and was collected on the bottom of the tube, and that's what I used for analysis.
Were you trying to remove all the blood from the evidence?
Well, I mean, I tried to remove as much as possible. The instrument, the way that it's set up, can take care of, you know, a very complex, dirty sample, but if you shoot too much in, you can clog up the system and cause excess damage to the instrument. So I tried to clean it up as much as possible.
Did you intentionally not try to remove all the blood from the swatch?
Oh, I thought,
Did you misunderstand?
I may have misunderstood your question.
Let me ask again.
Okay.
Did you try to remove all the blood from the swatch, the evidence swatch and the sock cutting you made?
I treated everything the same. All I tried to do was remove the EDTA. I wasn't really concerned too much with the blood. I wanted to remove EDTA from the blood stain was my purpose.
Can I take that you're saying, no, you didn't try to remove all the blood?
I mean, all I did was try to remove the EDTA from the stain for analysis.
Okay, so you tried to get all the EDTA out of there.
Exactly, yes.
And did you have any testing done to determine whether that method that you devised was effective in removing all the EDTA from a blood stain like the ones you used?
I determined that it was effective to remove EDTA from my analysis to determine whether or not the blood stain came from a preserved tube or non-preserved tube.
Agent Martz,
Yes.
did you do any testing to determine whether your system that you devised efficiently removed all of the EDTA from the evidence?
I didn't feel that was necessary. All I felt was necessary was to remove the EDTA for analysis. It didn't make any difference if I got 99.9% of the EDTA or 100% of the EDTA. I removed enough EDTA for the analysis.
Did it make any difference whether you got 60% of it?
It probably wouldn't have, no.
So you weren't trying to get all of the EDTA?
Certainly I was trying to get it all out.
Didn't you have some tests, or weren't some validation studies performed at Quantico to answer that very question, at how good your method was at pulling the EDTA out of the evidence if it was there?
If it was, I didn't understand that that was part of what they were doing.
Well, let me show you a couple of charts. We have these marked as, what are we up to? I'm sorry, 1269? 69? 1269 A and B. Agent Martz, did you review the validation materials that Quantico prepared for you?
No, I did not. They were not prepared for me.
Who asked Quantico to do a validation study to validate your method? Well, did anybody?
I don't know.
They did this on their own? You're aware they did it, aren't you?
Yes, yes.
When did they do this validation study?
Oh,
I don't know the specific time. I think it was before I had done any of my tests, or it may have been about the same time. I really don't know, to be perfectly honest with you.
Was that validation study done in connection with this case?
I believe the way they got involved is they were going to determine whether or not EDTA could be detected in trace quantities or in blood stains to differentiate preserved from non-preserved blood. They were asked to do this, and they were going to devise a procedure which then could be given to a laboratory to do the analysis. When this was all happening, it was determined that we would also try at headquarters to do the analysis ourselves. So I took it upon myself to do some preliminary tests and determined that I could do EDTA analysis. Quantico's testing was done to determine whether or not a procedure could be developed to give to another laboratory to do the testing.
Can we put that down as a yes, that their validation study was for purposes of this case?
Well, you'd have to ask them.
You didn't ask them?
Not specifically, no.
You weren't interested in any of the work they did validating this methodology that you're using?
Well,
Sustain.
it depends
Oh,
on.
wait, sustain.
Oh,
What's the purpose of a validation study?
well, I think I did my own validation study, and I think the purpose
Move
of
to strike non-responsive.
Sustain. Answer stricken.
What's the purpose of a validation
to
study?
determine whether or not a procedure works.
Is it your understanding that that's what your research people at Quantico did?
They produced something that they called a validation study. I know that, yes.
And is it your testimony that you never looked at it?
I never looked at it, no.
During the lunch break, could you review that for us? Because I want to ask you some questions about it.
I don't see any purpose for it, to be perfectly honest with you.
Well, let me show you 1269A and B. And for the record, 1269A is discovery page 8419. 1269B is 8422. You look at those, are those chromatograms?
Yes, they are.
They appear to be generated by the FBI.
I would not know that.
Is that format used by the FBI?
This is the format used by the Finnegan TSQ instrument.
Is that the format you use?
Well, it's one that we have available at the FBI laboratory, yes.
Same format as on all your charts?
Yes.
And let's assume hypothetically that tests were done to determine how efficient your method was at removing EDTA. You have that hypothetical in mind?
Okay.
How would you test that hypothesis?
Well, you would extract it and then run against the known.
Does it appear that that's what those charts do?
Oral.
Sustain.
Can you check with your people at Quantico over the lunch hour to see whether they did that test and what they found?
Oral. Oral.
Will you do that for me?
I don't know that they'll be here. I mean, I can call. What exactly do you want me to find out?
See whether...
Why don't we confer with Agent Martz at the lunch hour?
Okay. When the materials that you had put together were provided to the prosecutors, do you understanding that that validation study was provided as well?
Yes.
Then, is it fair to say that you didn't do any studies yourself to determine whether your method for extracting blood, or EDTA, was efficient?
I think I did. I think I did. On the February the 8th, I was given 2 samples by someone in the laboratory, one with EDTA and one without. And I was very easily able to determine which stain contained the EDTA and which one didn't.
All right, move to strike non-responsive.
Oral.
Did you ever run a test where you did an extraction and then you did a second extraction to see if you had picked up all the EDTA in the first extraction?
No.
Would you agree that if you didn't pick up all the EDTA in the first extraction, you're going to see less of it when you run the test?
Yes.
Have you done any tests at all to determine whether the age of a blood stain affects your ability to extract it with water alone?
Yes.
And do you have an opinion on whether aged blood stains can be extracted with the same efficiency with just water as new blood stains?
I had conducted several tests on old blood, and two from 1993, and I think the other one was from 1991. These were EDTA blood stains. And I was convinced, based on the analysis that I did with those stains, that the age of the blood, at least over 3 or 4 years, had no effect in me determining whether or not the stains were from preserved or non-preserved blood.
All right, move to strike that all as non-responsive.
Sustained. Answer stricken in its entirety.
Agent Martz.
Sergeant Martz, would you listen carefully, please, to the question? Answer the question that is directed to you, sir.
Did you do any tests to determine whether an old dried blood stain, not blood from a tube, but a blood stain that is older, can be just as efficiently extracted from that stain as a new blood stain that's been put on the stain and just dried for an hour or so with the use of plain water?
Yes, I did. I took 2 blood stains from 1993 that had been on material since 1993. I extracted those, and I got similar results for EDTA. That other blood that was freshly prepared, I got similar results.
Did you make any effort in that particular test, which, by the way, when did you do that? Saturday?
That was done last weekend.
Now, when you did that, did you make any effort to quantify the amount of blood that you were able to get out of that old blood stain?
No.
Do you have any other base of experience vis-a-vis old blood stains versus new blood stains in terms of how efficient just using water is at removing all the blood?
No.
Do you agree with Dr. Reeders that using an ammonia solution in water is a better way to make sure that you extract all the blood?
Well, I mean, are we talking blood or EDTA?
Both. Let's talk both.
For EDTA, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you.
And you did no testing to find that, answer that
No,
question either, did
no.
you? Now I want to ask you about the gate. Did you perform any tests, or to your knowledge, did your lab in Quantico perform any tests to determine whether or not a blood stain, an EDTA blood stain, placed on a metal gate and left exposed to the outside for, let's say, hypothetically, a day to 3 weeks, whether there would be any degradation or loss of EDTA?
No, I did not.
Did you ever make any effort to determine the type of paint that was on the back gate?
No, I didn't believe that it was necessary.
Paints have metals that tend to attract EDTA, don't they?
In my opinion, the EDTA would stay in the blood stain.
Paints have metals that EDTA likes, don't they? And is very attracted to them.
I think it would depend on the type of paint, yes.
Did you do any tests at all to determine whether the type of paint upon which a blood stain was deposited would attract some of the EDTA and remove it from the blood?
Well, I used one particular paint that we had in the laboratory, a metal surface. I don't know exactly which type of paint it was, but I was able to place a blood stain on a painted metal surface and effectively remove the EDTA.
What effort did you make to find out whether the paint you used bore any similarity to the back gate?
None.
Did you make any effort to find out whether there was any rust on the back gate where that blood stain was deposited?
No, again, I didn't feel it was necessary.
Does rust attract EDTA?
It could.
It's iron, isn't it?
Well, but iron exists in different states. That's iron oxide, and I don't know the properties of iron oxide for attracting EDTA.
EDTA loves iron, doesn't it?
In certain forms, depending on the pH.
Did you make any effort to determine what other environmental things might have, let me rephrase it. Did you make any effort to determine whether there was any fertilizer that had been used in the area of the gate and may have gotten on the bloodstain?
No, I did not.
Do fertilizers contain chemicals that are attracted to EDTA, or that EDTA is attracted to?
I don't really know how that's relevant, but I guess that they could.
Were you trying to, in your positive controls, design them in such a way that they mimicked as close as possible what you would have expected to find had EDTA blood been used and put on the back gate?
Well, I tried to do that to the best of what I had available, and I did that with the sock. I used the same sock. With a gate post, I didn't have that gate post. We're talking many months later when I got the samples. The gate post is certainly in different condition now than it was then. I couldn't stain it on the same area of the gate. Based on the testing that I did, I didn't feel that it was necessary to duplicate exactly the conditions because EDTA is a very, very stable chemical.
Isn't the purpose of a positive control to test the hypothesis? Let's assume that EDTA blood was used under the conditions which these stains were deposited, preserved, and collected, and see what we find. Isn't that what a positive control is for?
The positive control is to determine whether or not you can identify the substance that you're looking for in the matrix that it's on.
Is one of the purposes of a positive control to try and simulate the hypothesis? Let's assume that EDTA blood was used on these blood stains, and let's put it through the same type of conditions that the evidence was and see what we find at the end of the road.
Well, I mean, you can't duplicate everything exactly all the time. What you try to do is to duplicate as much as possible, and that's why I used a painted surface in the laboratory to duplicate a painted gate to determine whether or not I could remove EDTA from a painted surface.
Your painted surface, what was that? What kind of metal was that?
It was, I'm sure it was an iron. It was a can.
It was a can, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a can.
It wasn't anything like a gate, was it?
Sustain.
Well,
Sustain.
Okay. Now, other than, and by the way, when you painted your can, how long did you leave I'm sorry, when you put the blood stain on the can, how long did you leave it there before you swabbed it off?
probably 45 minutes.
Did you make any effort to deposit a stain on that can and leave it for a period of 1 day to 3 weeks to see what you might find?
No, I did not.
Did you ever make any efforts to determine what the weather was from June 12th to July 3rd, the period of time when that blood stain may have been on that gate?
No, I didn't feel that that was necessary for my determination.
Did you make any effort to determine whether that particular blood stain had changed in terms of being weathered from the time it was deposited until it was collected?
No, you've got to remember here, this blood stain has been identified as human blood. DNA is a very fragile chemical. EDTA is a very, very, very stable chemical. So I felt that if it could be determined that it was blood, that I would have no trouble determining the EDTA content.
Is your reason for not doing any of those things that I've been talking about is because you made assumptions that they wouldn't make any difference?
Well, I don't know that I'd necessarily call them, well, you could call them assumptions. It was based on some scientific information that I had that I based that on.
Is it based on any experimentation on your part at all?
Well, I think it is, in a way, experiments that I've performed over the last 20 years in the laboratory. I think it's based a lot on that.
You ever worked with didn't you say you'd never worked with EDTA until this case?
Well, I've worked with chemicals that are similar, and I know what the melting point and boiling point of EDTA is, its properties, its solubility, and there's certain assumptions, as he mentions, that you can make.
Let's talk about the sock. Did you make any effort? Let's assume that the sock was collected around June 13th. Okay? And did you make any effort to determine how many times the sock had been examined under high-intensity lights or any other kind of lighting during the period of time, June 13th, till you got it?
Or
No, again, I didn't feel it was necessary. EDTA, when dried, is a very, very, very stable chemical. The FDA would not use it as a preservative if it wasn't stable. It's a very stable chemical.
Are you aware of any study anywhere that looks at the effect of light on EDTA in a dried bloodstain?
No.
Did you perform any such test?
Well, in a sense I did. I looked at blood stains that were several years old.
Do you have any idea what the history of those bloodstains were, in terms of how often they'd been examined and under what conditions?
No, but I'm sure they were under various conditions.
How do you know that?
Well, it's part of the FBI's procedure to dry the blood stains on the cloth. They were dried back in 1993
Where did those stains come from?
on the
I'm
cloth.
sorry.
It was a case that was submitted to the FBI laboratory
Where did they come from?
from people.
In what form?
Liquid blood,
They were then made into stains?
that's correct.
So those weren't stains deposited on a surface like a gate or a sock at all, were they?
Well, I mean, they were stains that we placed onto fabric.
They weren't evidence stains from a crime scene of blood taken off of evidence, were they?
No.
Did you do any tests to determine whether the effects of sudden temperature change, or what the effects might be on EDTA in the sock of sudden temperature changes?
No, again, I didn't feel it was necessary. EDTA is a very stable chemical that will decompose, I think, at about 290 degrees centigrade. It's a very hot temperature. It's a very stable chemical.
Are you aware of any studies that look at that question?
No.
So again, you're saying that you're making assumptions that it wouldn't make a difference, that's why you didn't check for it.
I'm making assumptions based on my 20 years of experience working with chemicals.
Is one of the reasons you didn't do some of these things is that you were kind of rushed on this?
No, I believe that I was able to answer the question which was put to me, and that was my sole objective, to answer the question, and I believe I was able to do that without doing all the things that have been mentioned.
Would you agree that you have had time since your testing in February to do some of these validation type studies that I've suggested?
Well, I mean, you must realize I'm in charge of a unit at the FBI laboratory. I'm presently now in charge of the section until we get a new section chief. I'm wearing a lot of different hats. I'm working cases, reviewing the work of over 20 people, and right now I'm actually in charge of over 200 people. I'm in charge of the whole scientific analysis section of the FBI laboratory in the interim till we get a new section chief. So I do have a lot of responsibilities at the FBI laboratory, and I believe that I answered the question satisfactorily. I did not need to do any other testing. Since the other day, I've performed a few more tests, but other than that, I didn't feel that any other testing was needed.
All right, so can I take it from that answer that it is a time problem? It would take a lot of time.
Well, it's that plus necessary. Was it necessary for me to do any other testing to answer the question? In my opinion, it was not.
Okay. What is the appropriate method if you're going to use mass spectrometry to quantify the amount in an unknown sample?
Well, there's many different ways.
What's the most accepted?
Well, I don't know whether it's the most accepted, but to me, the best way in mass spectrometry is to use what's called a deuterated standard, and that's what we routinely use at the FBI laboratory for quantitation. It's a very expensive means of quantitation, but I believe it's the most effective in mass spectrometry for precise quantitation.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, an internal standard is something that's very close to the EDTA, but you know it's there and you know how much is there, correct?
Correct.
And it's actually mixed in with the stain, with the liquid that you're going to look at, correct?
That's correct.
In other words, it's not run at one time and then your evidence is run at a second time.
Correct.
And the reason why you'd run them together is because you can get this wide variation from one run to the next in terms of what comes out of the machine, right?
Well, it depends on your definition of wide variation. There is some variation, but it's an acceptable variation.
Well, you would agree that getting a fourfold difference on two things that are identical is not terribly precise, is it?
Not for precise quantitation.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, we talked about whether you used an internal standard or not in Washington, did we not?
Yes, we
Do
did.
you remember what you told me about that?
Well, I told you I would have liked to use an internal standard, and the deuterated standard was not available.
Actually, you recall telling me that you would have loved to have had one.
I would have loved to have had one, and then I wouldn't have had to answer so many questions. But
And you remember telling me that it was the ultimate way to quantify.
that's the way that we prefer it at the FBI laboratory.
You didn't use an internal standard, did you?
It was not available.
You didn't use an internal standard, did you?
I did not use one because one was not available for the type of testing that I did.
What efforts did you do to try and find one?
I contacted the manufacturer, one of the largest, Radion, of deuterated standards. They told me that it would be at least 3 months to develop it. It was a very expensive price also. The price didn't matter so much, but it was a time limit. It would be at least 3 months to develop that standard for me, or to make that standard.
Who is Cambridge?
That could be a company out of Canada that also makes deuterated standards.
Did you ever check with them?
No, I did not.
So you checked with one company.
I checked with the one that we generally do business with, which is one of the larger producers of the deuterated standards.
How many other companies are there that produce these kinds of standards?
I don't know, to be perfectly honest.
Did you make any effort to find out any other companies that might have one?
I believe when I inquired with the one company, I asked them if they knew of any other company that produced it, and I believe their response was they didn't know of any other company.
Mr. Blasier, about 5 more minutes.
5 minutes?
5 more minutes.
Okay. What's your understanding of a deuterated standard in terms of its cost?
Well, to have one developed is totally different than to buy one. Generally, you can buy them for several $100s, but to have one developed may be many, many, many thousands of dollars.
So would you agree if one were commercially available, it certainly would be within the budget of the FBI?
Oh, sure, yes. Oh, sure.
Now I want to ask you about your underlying data for the test that you did. Let's talk about the ones in February. I take it that these charts don't pop out of the machine, do they?
No, you have to request them, or you actually tell the instrument to print out a particular chart.
Now the data that's coming out of the machine, the raw data, what happens to that?
It's stored on a computer.
And it's stored on a computer for possible later analysis?
Well, generally what we do at the FBI laboratory is after the case is completed, we'll erase the file because we only have so much storage space. So after we've dictated the case and all the review's been done, we'll erase the files.
After you've completed the case. Now, where's the raw data that you did that formed the basis for all these charts right now?
It no longer exists. It was erased off the computer when the case was dictated.
It's been destroyed.
Well, yes.
Now, does the FBI in their computer system have what's called a backup system?
Not for the instruments in the laboratory.
Now, did you assume that when you had dictated your report that you were done with this case?
I was done with those analysis. I had made my opinion, a very careful opinion, and I was convinced of this. And as far as I was concerned, I did not need to look at that data again. I had made my conclusion. I had printed out the appropriate charts, and I would not need to see that data again.
Weren't you expecting that you would be called as a prosecution witness up until the day they rested?
Sustain.
Wasn't your state of mind such that you knew or you anticipated that you would be called to testify by the prosecution in this case?
Sustain.
Did you know when the data was destroyed that this trial was still going on?
Or we'll
Yes.
the question.
Would you agree that without your underlying data, there's no way that some other person can review that data.
Well, obviously, in this case, someone has reviewed it, so I don't know how I can agree with that.
No, I'm talking about the underlying data that forms the basis for the generation of these charts, the digital data.
Can you ask that question again?
Yeah. Would you agree that the fact that you've destroyed the digital data, which is the underlying raw data for these tests, makes it impossible for anyone to review that digital data, anyone other than you? And even you can't review
Well, I
it.
can't even review it. I mean, that data is gone. Nobody can review that data anymore. But the charts that represent the digital data have been printed out, and those can be reviewed.
Would you agree that there are different ways to analyze your digital data with this kind of a test other than the charts you produced?
I don't know that I understand that question.
Do you know, I'm sorry, do you know whether there are other ways to analyze digital data that comes out of the machine other than by producing just this kind of chart?
I'm sure that there are, but, you know, at the FBI laboratory, what we do is try to make identifications. And for that, we have certain charts that we print out that represent whether something is there or not. And that's what we do all the time. Whether someone can do something else with that digital data, I don't know. It's not something that we do at the FBI laboratory.
Are you not familiar with the other methods that you can use with your Finnegan system to generate, using the raw data, to do different kinds of analysis?
Maybe if you could give me some specific...
All right, Mr. Blasier, we're going to take a break at this point. We're going to take a break. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break for the noon hour. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourself or any opinions about the case. Conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you, or allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And Agent Marcia ordered to come back at 1:30. All right, we'll be in recess until 1:30. All right, let me see counsel without the court reporter, please. Mr. Simpson is again present with his counsel. People are represented, jury is not present, and Agent Martz is present. Counsel, anything we need to take up before we invite the jurors to rejoin us? All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. And counsel, if you recollect, we will conclude today at 4 o'clock, at least as far as the jury is concerned. And we have a number of legal arguments we can take up at 4 o'clock. All right, good afternoon, Agent Martz.
Good afternoon.
Agent Martz, you are reminded, sir, that you are still under oath, and Mr. Blasier, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Agent Martz.
Good afternoon.
During the lunch break, did you have an opportunity to call your folks at Quantico regarding the question of whether your method of extraction allowed you to remove all the EDTA?
Yes, I did.
And did you make a determination as to whether, first of all, did they test your method?
Yes, they did.
And did they determine that your method was capable or allowed you to remove 100% of the EDTA from the sample you were extracting?
They removed approximately 93% was the average.
So they determined that your method did not remove all the EDTA, correct?
That's correct.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about destroying your data. Did you indicate that your criterion for when it's okay to destroy the data was when you thought a case was over?
No, once it's dictated.
Once it's dictated?
Once the case has been dictated and the report has left the laboratory.
Okay. How long after the report's left the laboratory, in your mind, is it okay to destroy the data?
Immediately.
Now, would you agree that using that standard, that never allows other scientists to review your data?
Well, I mean, we provide the data, like in this case, the printouts, but the electronic data is lost, yes.
And as part of your function as a criminalist, as an expert, You testify in cases, and there oftentimes are experts on other sides of the case, correct?
That's correct.
And is your understanding that it's common practice for one expert from one side of the case to look at the other expert's data to see if they made the right decision, right interpretations?
In the 20 years that I've been in the FBI laboratory, no one has ever asked to look at the digital data until now.
Did you find out from Quantico whether they saved their digital data?
Yes, they did.
Is it your understanding that, well, would you agree with this? It would be relatively easy for you to have saved your data if you wanted to.
Well, not relatively easy. There's only a limited amount of space on the hard drive, and once that is full, then you have to find another means of saving that data. And I wouldn't agree that it's that easy. It's certainly not complicated, but it's something that we don't practice at the laboratory.
Well, there are tape backup systems for the kind of computer you have that are very easy to attach and use, aren't there?
Well, I don't know about easy to attach and use, but they are available, yes. The deck equipment is quite complex in attachments. It's not like a simple, PC home computer.
Now, do you accept that with that underlying digital data, you could do some additional things such as averaging spectra?
Yes.
And you could also do some further analysis by involving subtracting out background noise.
Yes.
And these are things that you can no longer do because your data is gone, correct?
Well, you can't do it on those data. You could always rerun the same samples or similar samples. There is blood stain left in this particular case. If someone wanted to analyze that stain, they could certainly analyze it.
But as far as the test that you're testifying about, that can't be done, can it?
No.
Now, you described to us how you made your positive control samples, and that's case 67 and case 68.
Those were the blood samples that I used to make my positive controls, yes.
And that was taken directly from the reference tubes of Mr. Simpson and Miss Simpson.
That's my understanding, yes.
Could you show me in your notes where you describe that process?
Right there.
Do your notes tell you how large a swatch you made?
No, they don't.
Now, I want to ask you some questions about the test that you performed on your own blood. You have that in mind?
Yes.
Now, when did you do that test?
I believe the first one was April the 11th.
Do you have any records that you can check that?
Yes. I'm sorry, it's May 11th, 1995.
Did you make any notes describing how you did that experiment?
No, I did not.
You didn't write anything down, did you?
No.
Is it standard practice in your laboratory when you're performing tests like that that you don't write anything down?
Well, if you perform the test the same way you perform the other tests that are written, sometimes the person may or may not elect to write down the exact same thing that he wrote down before. In this particular case, I examined it the same way I had examined all the other samples, and I did not write down how I did it.
So you performed these tests the same way that you did the other tests you've been testifying about?
Pretty much so. I made a cutting, I extracted it with water, filtered, centrifuged, and injected.
Well, you didn't use a blood stain from evidence, did you?
No.
Describe to me how you got non-EDTA blood to use.
I went to the health service and I asked them to take 2 blood samples. I told them to take a non-EDTA sample first and then collect an EDTA sample. So they took a red stopper tube, collected blood, and then took a purple stopper tube and collected blood.
Now, the red top tube, does that have any chemicals in it to preserve the blood?
I believe the one that they used was a serum collection tube, and I don't know if it did or not. I know it didn't have EDTA in it.
Do you know whether a red top tube has any kind of preservative in it at all?
No.
Now, from the point in time when you had your blood drawn into a red top tube, how long was it until you made a swatch?
I believe it was several days.
Do you have any information indicating that the blood stains in this case were ever put in a red top tube and allowed to sit for several days?
No, I do not.
So would you agree that that particular set of conditions that you did isn't anything like the testing that you did of the evidence in this case?
No, I would disagree with that. EDTA is very soluble in blood, and in my opinion, it will be throughout the blood sample. And in preparing those samples, I don't believe that would make a difference.
When you put this blood in a red top tube and let it sit for several days, where did it sit?
In the refrigerator at work.
And was it still blood when you got it out several days later?
Yes.
How long does it take blood to coagulate, unpreserved?
Oh, I think about 5 minutes.
Did this blood coagulate at all?
Yes.
So it had been coagulating for 5 days
It was a couple of days, yes.
and sitting in the red top tube for 5 days.
That's correct.
Have any indication that the blood that was used on these stains was clotted blood?
No.
One of the things that EDTA is used in is rubber, correct?
I don't know that specifically, but I would assume that it could be.
What's the stopper made out of on the red top tube that you had the blood in for several days?
I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you.
Look like rubber?
It's either a rubber or a synthetic rubber.
Is the inside of a red top tube coated with anything?
The red test tubes that were used had a chemical in them. I don't know what it was.
Silicone?
I don't know.
Do you know whether there's EDTA in silicone on the insides of blood tubes?
No, I do not.
Did you ever do any studies by putting plain water in a red top tube, letting it sit for several days, and testing to see whether it had any EDTA in it?
No, I did not.
So is it fair to say that you do not know the answer to the question of whether or not the EDTA, or what looked like EDTA that you found in your blood, came from the tube itself?
I don't know that EDTA has ever been used in anything other than the purple top tube. Other than that, I don't have any information.
Now, I'm not talking about EDTA as a preservative in a liquid form in the tube. I'm talking about the tube itself containing materials that have EDTA. Did you do any research at all to determine whether or not what you found in your blood came from the tube rather than you?
No.
Now, when you went back this weekend, you ran that sample again, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And it had been sitting in, at that point, sitting in the red top tube for how long?
Well, since May, and then I analyzed it in July.
Okay.
May.
Was your purpose in running it again to determine whether you really had EDTA in your blood or not?
No, it was just to show the stability of EDTA over time.
So you weren't trying to determine whether you had EDTA in your blood when you did the second run?
The purpose of all of my experiments from the beginning, as I mentioned, were to determine whether or not the blood stains were from preserved or non-preserved blood, and to differentiate between preserved and non-preserved blood. I had.
Agent Martz,
Yes, sir.
the question was, the second run in July, what was the purpose of doing that? The second run.
To distinguish between preserved blood and non-preserved blood, to show that I could do that on blood that had aged for several months.
What would be the best way, if you really wanted to test whether you had EDTA in your blood, what would be the best way to do that, in your opinion?
I don't know about the best way. I'm sure that I do have EDTA in my blood. The question is how much I have in my blood, And to determine how much I have would depend on which instrumentation I would use. And I would probably want to take a larger volume of blood and somehow or another concentrate the EDTA for analysis.
Well, you would agree, would you not, that the amount of EDTA you would expect in your blood from your diet is in the parts per billion range?
I don't know that I could agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's any data that substantiates that.
All of the studies that we've looked at that you've provided to us indicate that, don't they?
There was one study in 1954, and it had conflicting information.
By the way, the textbook that I mentioned to you, do you remember the authors' names?
Goodman and Goodman and I think I remember.
That's a 1994 textbook, isn't it?
But I believe in that particular case, they're referring back to the original study.
Well, it's a 1994 textbook, isn't it? Is it a well-accepted, current work of expertise in the area of pharmacology?
Well, I think what it has is references of the last work that was done in a particular area.
Is this a treatise that is used in pharmacology as a standard reference work?
It's a reference book, yes.
Do you know of any other reference work that contradicts that?
Yeah, as I mentioned, in 1954, there was conflicting data in that paper.
That's the one paragraph we read?
Right.
Anything else?
I think there's been some other studies on iron EDTA and its absorption that may or may not conflict it.
Did you research that?
I can't remember the exact articles, but there possibly was some other conflicting data on iron EDTA.
When you researched this, did you attempt to find that kind of literature?
What I was trying to find in literature was how much EDTA would be present in a person,
Mhm.
and I could not satisfactorily answer that question.
But one of the things you'd look for is how much is absorbed, for instance, with iron, right?
Well, one of the things that would be critical to determine that would be how much EDTA would be absorbed.
Those studies, the ones that you are referring to, can you give me the name of one of them?
Not right offhand.
When you pulled together the literature to prepare for your testimony, is it fair to say that you tried to get the articles that were the most relevant to what you were going to testify about?
I tried to get most relevant articles on EDTA.
Okay. Now, by the way, where is the underlying data when you ran your own blood? The digital data.
It's been erased.
Did you ever write a report on testing your own blood?
No, it was not casework.
Then why did you destroy it before you dictated a report?
There was nothing to dictate. It was research that I had performed on my own blood.
Was it done for this case?
Yes,
Did you tell the prosecution you were going to do it?
I don't believe I did.
Did you tell them after you did it what the results were?
I believe it was furnished to them at the same time it was furnished to you when you visited me on about a week ago Tuesday.
So you never wrote, I'm sorry, were you done?
Yeah, I never wrote a report.
Were you ever asked to conduct any kind of a study to determine taking other people than you, checking their blood directly rather than putting it in any kind of a container to see whether there's EDTA?
No.
Did the prosecution ever ask you to test any of the samples, the other forensic samples in this case, blood stains that may have come from Nicole Brown Simpson, for instance, to see whether they showed EDTA?
No.
Did they ever ask you to check any stains in the area of stains collected in Chicago to determine whether there's any EDTA in Mr. Simpson's blood from those stains?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
Did they ever ask you to test any of the other evidence in this case to see if there was EDTA present?
Not to my knowledge.
That's all I have.
Ms. Clark.
Agent Martz, first of all, based on all of the testing that you conducted in this case, did you come to a conclusion as to whether or not the evidence bloodstains taken from the rear gate and taken from the socks found in the defendant's bedroom had blood that came from the tube with a preservative known as EDTA?
Yes, I did.
And what conclusion was that?
I concluded based on the work that I done on the 19th, the 22nd, and the 28th that the blood stains in question did not come from preserved blood. They did not come from blood that was preserved with EDTA.
Now, you were subpoenaed to testify here by the defense, is that correct?
That is correct.
You've been asked a series of questions by Mr. Blasier concerning experiments and whether or not you'd conducted them.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
You were asked whether you conducted experiments to determine whether EDTA will break down if it is in blood that is on a metal surface such as a rear gate.
Yes.
You know who Dr. Reeders is, correct?
Yes, I do.
You are familiar with the equipment he has in his lab?
Yes, I am.
You know who Dr. Ballard is?
Yes, I do.
Is he present here in court today?
Yes, he is.
Is he seated right back there at counsel table?
Yes, he is.
You see the gentleman in the long blonde hair and the glasses?
Yes, he is.
Are you familiar with the equipment that he has, sir?
Some of the equipment that he has, yes.
Does he have a liquid chromatograph tandem mass spectrometer?
To my knowledge, he does not have a liquid chromatograph mass spectrometer.
What is it that he has, to your knowledge?
I believe that he has mass spec capabilities.
Then the equipment that is possessed by Dr. Reeders and by Dr. Ballard, is that equipment sufficient to conduct the experiment of determining whether or not EDTA will break down or degrade when in blood on metal such as a gate?
Yes, it is.
And did Dr. Reeders ever confer with you about any experiments that he had conducted in that regard?
No, he did not.
Or did Dr. Ballard?
No.
You were asked whether or not you'd conducted any experiments to determine whether the type of paint found on the rear gate at 875 South Bundy would degrade EDTA in blood if placed on that paint. You remember that?
Yes, I remember.
To your knowledge, could Dr. Reeders perform such an experiment?
Yes, he could.
Could Dr. Ballard perform such an experiment?
Yes, he could.
To your knowledge, have they?
To my knowledge, they have not.
You were asked also, sir, about whether or not rust, such as what may be present on the rear gate at 875 South Bundy, may interact with EDTA to degrade it if in blood on that surface. You recall that question?
Yes, I do.
Could Dr. Reeders perform a test to determine whether or not that substance would degrade EDTA in blood?
Now, I'm going to object to this line of questioning and ask to approach if necessary.
What's corporal, please? Thank you, counsel. Proceed. Rust. Rust. Never sleeps.
You were asked a question as to whether or not you conducted any experiments to determine whether or not EDTA in a blood stain on a rusty surface will degrade as a result of contact with that rust. Do you recall that question?
Yes, I do.
Could Dr. Reeders perform such an experiment, sir, to
Yes, he-
determine whether or not EDTA would degrade under those conditions?
Yes, he could.
And to your knowledge, has he?
To my knowledge, he has not.
You recall you were asked a question as to whether or not you conducted any testing as to whether or not fertilizer, if EDTA in a blood stain was subjected to fertilizer, whether that would break down the EDTA. You recall that question?
Yes, I do.
Could Dr. Reeders perform such a test or experiment, sir?
Yes, he could.
And to your knowledge, has he?
To my knowledge, he has not.
Do you recall questions concerning whether or not high-intensity light focused on the socks might degrade any EDTA that was present in the bloodstains on that sock? Remember?
Yes, I do.
To your knowledge, could Dr. Reeders perform such an examination or such an experiment to determine whether or not EDTA would degrade under that condition?
Yes, he could.
To your knowledge, has he?
To my knowledge, he has not.
You were asked a series of questions concerning whether or not sudden temperature changes could cause EDTA to degrade in blood. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Could Dr. Reeders perform experiments to determine whether or not sudden temperature changes would affect or degrade EDTA?
Yes, he could.
To your knowledge, has he done so?
To my knowledge, he has not.
Now, you indicated that you did confer with Dr. Reeders concerning the subject matter of this case on a couple of occasions, correct?
It was on one occasion last week.
Proceed.
It was on one occasion, I believe it was last week.
Now, the graphs that you generated as a result of the testing that you conducted were furnished to the prosecution and to the defense back in late February, early March?
The one graph was, there was additional graphs that I did this weekend.
Other than the ones that you did this last weekend, was the other data submitted to the defense and the prosecution months ago?
Yes, it was.
At any point did Dr. Reeders call to tell you that he could not form conclusions or opinions because such experiments as I previously outlined to you had not been done?
No, he did not.
Now, you recall that Dr. Reeders testified that he felt that based on the EPA study concerning the maximum tolerance for EDTA in the blood based on an experiment with fish, extrapolated from that the normal amount or the maximum amount you would find in people would be in parts per billion. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
In your expert opinion, sir, was it appropriate for him to use that EPA study to form a conclusion as to what would be the normal amount of EDTA you would expect to find in an average person?
I don't believe so. When I first got that study, which was, I believe, 2 nights ago, maybe it was Sunday night, I received that study, and the first thing in looking at it, it appeared to be out of place. They were talking about toxic cleanup of EDTA, and they had a lot of things that were mentioned, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere came the fact that it said 1 part per billion would be normally expected in a human or considered to be the normal level. And it just didn't make sense to me why that would be there. So what I did was the next morning I called back to the laboratory and had them search the same reference. And it ended up that it was not a part per million, but it was 1,000, or a part per billion, it was 1,000 parts per million. Evidently, when it was printed out without good resolution, I really don't have the explanation now. In talking to EPA, they claim that it's 1,000 parts per million is what it's supposed to be. So I did some further research, and it ended up that that was solely based on some studies to determine how much EDTA was needed to preserve blood. It had absolutely nothing at all what to do with the amount that would be expected in a person or could be toxic to a person. It was completely out of context, and it was wrong.
Now, if all of the, well, are you aware, sir, of any study that has been conducted to determine what amount of EDTA you could expect to find in any one of us on a given day?
No, I'm not aware of any study.
Now, you were asked a series of questions about the quantification of blood in the samples that you took for testing. You recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
Now, if you wanted the exact quantification of the amount of blood that you are testing, you could do the test that counsel proposed. Is that correct?
Well, what that does is determines how much hemoglobin is in the blood, and from that you can estimate how much blood is present.
All right. Now, the evidence that you're speaking of that you tested, sir, that evidence is still in existence?
As far as I know, it is, yes.
And are you aware, sir, that the evidence has been in the possession of the defense on more than one occasion?
Yes, I am.
And could they have conducted the test they proposed to you to conduct in terms of quantifying the amount of blood in any given sample?
Objection.
Sustained.
Could a scientist with the capabilities that you're aware of in Dr. Reeder's lab conduct the tests outlined to you by counsel for the quantification of blood in any given sample?
Objection.
Yes.
Now, if what you want to know is whether or not any EDTA that may be detected in a stain comes from preserved tube, a preservative EDTA tube, or comes from natural blood that has low levels of EDTA, would it be important to quantify with precision the amount of EDTA that you find?
Not in this particular case. The studies that I did and the studies that were done at Quantico demonstrated very easily that you could determine between preserved blood and non-preserved blood. We're talking a factor of 100 to 1,000 times as much EDTA in preserved blood. And as I mentioned, we don't even know what the amount of EDTA is in human blood. And as I mentioned also, we don't even know whether, in fact, EDTA was found in these particular samples. The only thing I know for sure is EDTA was present in the control blood samples that I made from the K67 and K68 blood samples.
Now, you were asked if you had determined whether or not the red top tube has some EDTA in it, just by the virtue of the way it's manufactured. Do you recall that question?
Yes, I do.
Would you be capable of testing the tube to determine that?
Yes, I would.
Would Dr. Reeders be capable of testing the tube to determine that?
Yes, he would.
With respect to, you were questioned about destroying data, the digital data. First of all, what is counsel referring to with respect to the digital data?
Well, in the mass spectrometer, it's a very complex instrument, and you're acquiring a lot of data. For all the points that you want, you're acquiring a lot of data that is really not relevant, and it takes up a lot of computer space. What you're doing is waiting for the peak to come out, but you're acquiring the data the whole time. So each time you perform a scan on the instrument, you're saving that data. Each 1.5 seconds, I'm storing a lot of data on the computer. I'm recording all the masses that I'm looking for and putting it on the computer. So then I can retrieve after the run is over and look to determine whether something is present or not, and then I will print out that data that is relevant to the case.
And when you print out the data that's relevant to the case, are you referring to the graphs that have been, some of which have been shown?
Yes.
What does the digital data do in terms of helping you to interpret that graph?
Well, the digital data allows me to select the appropriate scan or mass spectrum to print out. The printout is what I interpret, which comes from the digital data, but I make my interpretation based on the chart that is printed out.
Now, if what someone wants is the digital data that backs up the graphs that you have generated, could you go back and test the evidence again and preserve that digital data?
Yes, you could.
Has anyone asked you to do that?
No, they have not.
When Mr. Blasier visited you in Washington, D.C., did he ask you to do that?
No, he did not.
And the graphs that you've presented here in court, are those an accurate depiction of the results of the testing that you performed?
Yes, they are.
So the digital data simply tells you where to print out a graph?
Well, it has all the data that's been stored, only some of that is relevant. I will go through, take out the relevant data, print it out, and put that with the case.
And so what that, the relevant data being the graphs that we've seen here in court?
That's correct.
All right, you're aware of Dr. Reeder's capability, sir. Could he test the blood of Nicole Brown Simpson that is currently in evidence for EDTA?
I believe that he could.
To your knowledge, has he done so?
To my knowledge, he has not.
In fact, as far as you know, and as far as you are aware, sir, Dr. Reeders has done nothing more than take your test results and give his own interpretation to them. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
And he has performed no independent tests on any of the evidence in this case?
That's my understanding.
Sir, you were asked whether or not you had taken blood stains recovered from metal and aged them for 3 weeks to determine whether or not you could still detect EDTA in them. Do you recall that question?
Yes, I do.
If the hypothesis given to you is that there is an allegation that evidence has been planted at or near the time of collection and not aged for 3 weeks, would it have any relevance to age that blood stain for 3 weeks before testing it for EDTA?
No, I mean, if you're going to try to duplicate exactly what happened, you would want to do it the same time period. As I mentioned earlier, I don't believe that either of those would be necessary in the case of EDTA. It is such a stable chemical.
And could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, EDTA is used as a preservative. It's used because it is a very stable chemical, and it also helps to stabilize other chemicals. Its melting point, or it decomposes at about 300 degrees centigrade. That's a very hot temperature. I've seen no studies at all that EDTA will break down when it's in the dry form. And based on the studies that I've done on the blood, I can very easily identify EDTA in preserved blood that is several years old.
And how were you able to prove that, sir?
Well, I took the blood stains that we had in the laboratory that were on swatches since 1993, and I analyzed those, and I got similar results as I get from preserved blood that's preserved today, or weeks ago.
You were talking about a validation study, sir. First of all, let me ask you this. The procedures and methods that you employed to determine whether or not you could detect and then identify EDTA in any of the samples in this case, was that any new method that you've never used before?
No, I'm basically using the mass spectrometer, which I've used in the laboratory since 1975. That's my opinion is based on the mass spectrum of the chemicals.
In the course of your work for the FBI, sir, over the past 20 years, how common is it for you to be asked to look for a certain chemical in either blood or urine?
It's very common.
And so you're being requested to look for EDTA in this case. Was that an unusual request in terms of being asked to look for a chemical in either blood or urine?
No, I mean, we're a chemistry toxicology unit, and we're routinely asked to identify not only a known chemical, but unknown chemicals. A lot of times we receive evidence that people don't know what the chemical is, and they want us to tell them what the chemical, drug, or poison is.
So in a case like that, where you're submitted a sample and they just say, tell us what's in it, is that in order of magnitude harder or more difficult or easier than being told, look for this particular compound?
It can be all of the above. In a drug case, if you're giving a white powder, a lot of times you will test to see if it's cocaine or heroin. A lot of times it may not be. In cases we've had in the past where people have sold something purported to be cocaine, it may end up being boric acid, which is a poison. Cocaine is sometimes cut with boric acid. So a lot of times we may be looking for one thing and it may be another. You really don't know what you're dealing with a lot of times. But we do have the capability in the laboratory to not only identify a chemical that we suspect, but unknown chemicals.
So have you been asked in the past to identify a chemical for the first time?
Yes, on many occasions.
That's a routine thing?
Pretty much in our unit of the laboratory, the chemistry toxicology, it's fairly routine to identify something that either somebody else can identify, doesn't have the capability to identify, or has never seen before.
In the course of your work for the FBI, sir, as unit chief, do you ever teach mass spectrophotometry?
Yes, I do. We have a facility down at Quantico, Virginia, and I've been teaching at Quantico probably since about 1980, different courses in mass spectrometry, primarily relating to some of the fields that we do in the unit: arson analysis, toxicology, general chemistry, chromatography classes, explosive classes, a variety of classes in which mass spectrometry is used. And we actually had a course several years ago for the first time where we invited people that do mass spectrometry, and we had a one-week course just on mass spectrometry.
And who was it that you were teaching in that class?
Generally, peers, people from other laboratories that are doing forensic chemistry and toxicology.
Would that mean private labs, such as those run by Dr. Reeders?
Generally, for our classes, they're generally government labs. However, we do have symposiums. We're having one coming up in arson, and we're going to invite people from not only the government, but from private laboratories.
And in that regard, sir, you indicated that you're a member of currently only one of the forensic organizations noted by counsel. I can't remember which one right now.
It was the Mid-Atlantic Association of Forensic Scientists.
Thank you. Now, in those organizations, sir, do people get together and exchange ideas, the new trends that are happening in toxicology?
Yes, they do.
In the course of your job, sir, do you interact daily with people from around the country and, in fact, around the world concerning the latest trends in toxicology?
In both chemistry and toxicology, yes, I do.
Is it unusual for a local agency such as Los Angeles to request the assistance of the FBI, the toxicology unit, to assist in performing tests as you did in this case?
No, it is not.
Is it a fairly routine thing for you to be requested by local agencies to perform testing in some regard?
Yes, it is.
Now, you indicated that you testified for the defense on one occasion?
Yes, I did.
What was that? What was that experience?
It was a murder case in where two police officers were being accused of murder. One of the people they were arresting was killed or died.
And what did you have to do in that case?
It was something that I do, I shouldn't say fairly routinely, but something else I'm involved in is drug testing in hair. In that particular case, I had done some drug testing in the victim's hair.
Sir, does it matter to you which side calls you in terms of whether or not you tell the truth?
No, not at all.
Your tests are your tests, your results are your results?
That's correct.
Regarding the validation study, sir, you indicate that the Quantico's result was that your method of extraction of EDTA recovered 93%.
On average, recovered 93%, yes.
Now, do you use the same method of extraction for the evidence stains as you do for the reference sample?
Yes.
So, for example, if you are extracting EDTA from a cloth swatch that has blood from the reference tube of Ms. Brown, and you are extracting EDTA from a cloth swatch that has the blood from the rear gate, are you using the same method?
Yes, I am.
So whatever amount of EDTA you're leaving behind in the reference stain, you're leaving behind in the evidence stain. Is that a fair statement?
It's a fair statement. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly 100%. You wouldn't get 93 in this and 93, but it would be relatively the same amount that you would expect to extract, yes.
And what impact, if any, would there be on the ultimate result in terms of the relative degrees or relative amounts of EDTA would there be on any discrepancy in the amount of EDTA extracted from the evidence stain versus the reference sample?
In my opinion, it would have no effect whatsoever. We're dealing with chemicals that are placed in blood at 2,000 parts per million. That is a very, very, very large quantity of any substance in the blood. It's very easy to distinguish 2,000 parts per million from what could possibly be 1 part per million. And as you notice, I said possibly. I'm not even convinced that what was found in my blood and in the sock and in the gate was EDTA. I was not able to prove that. If it is, it's still in the parts per million at the most. And distinguish between parts per million, 1 or 2 parts per million, and 2,000 parts per million in chemistry with analytical instruments is very easy to do.
So, sir, then are you saying that the dramatic difference in the results more than compensates for any small degree of variation?
That is correct.
Now, you indicated earlier that you were not trying to quantitate. In other words, you weren't trying to tell us, well, I have precisely these many parts per million of EDTA in the evidence stains and these many parts per million in the reference stains. Do you recall testifying to that?
That's correct. My whole reason for doing this was to differentiate preserved blood from non-preserved blood.
And for that purpose, sir, is it necessary to quantify with the precision that you were being asked about before, that is to perform tests specifically for quantification?
No, it is not.
Why not?
Because the instrument was mentioned earlier, had a fourfold difference in the 50 part per billion standard. Between 1 part per million and 1,000 parts per million, we have a 1,000-fold difference. So these are very, very, very different numbers. It's very easy to differentiate between what possibly could be 1 or 2 parts per million from what is between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million.
And so it becomes very obvious without the need for precise quantification.
That's correct.
Let me show you some charts. I'd rather I was going to question you more about that, but I think that maybe we can show it
Okay.
better than tell it. Now, you indicated to us, I think, earlier that you began testing on February 8th.
February 8th was the day that I had someone prepare 2 samples in the laboratory, one with EDTA and one without, from 2 test tubes of blood that we had in the laboratory from the same person. Those were prepared. I analyzed them with the procedure developed by myself and at Quantico, and analyzed for the presence of EDTA. And I was very easily able to determine which of the stains came from preserved blood.
And how was that?
That was done with the first experiment I ran, which is negative ion mass spectrometry, and I got a fairly substantial signal for the one with the EDTA, and I got no signal for the sample that didn't have the EDTA.
Now, when you did that, sir, were you in possession of the evidence from this case, that is the sock and the gate stains?
No, I was not.
So how did you perform that test? On what?
It was performed on the blood that we had in the laboratory from a case in which we put onto filter paper.
And how old was that blood?
I think that blood was approximately 6 months old. It was one of the older cases we had in the unit.
And how did you retrieve an unpreserved sample? You know what I mean? You had obviously sample from a reference tube, an EDTA tube, correct?
In this particular case, in a lot of cases, they submit to the laboratory blood in both red stopper tubes and purple stopper tubes. In this particular case, they had submitted both of those samples.
So the red stopper tubes are the ones without EDTA preservative.
That's correct.
Now, you were asked a series of questions concerning that, about whether blood in a test tube that has coagulated to some degree, because it's not in preservative, the red cap tube, whether that would affect the finding on EDTA. And in your opinion, would the coagulation of the blood affect any EDTA readings you may get?
Objection, no foundation, no qualification, cancer system, foundation.
Let me put it to you another way. You said that you removed your own blood and put it in a red stopper tube for testing.
Well, I didn't.
Sustained, phrase question.
Blood was taken from you and put in a red stopper tube?
That's correct.
All right. And you tested that for EDTA?
Yes,
And you obtained the result that you did?
that's correct.
And when you first began the testing on February 8th, you said you had blood that was in the purple cap tube, that's the EDTA blood, and then you had purple in a red cap, blood in a red cap tube, which is non-EDTA preserved, correct?
Yes.
When you tested that non-EDTA preserved blood in a red stopper tube on February 8th, what result did you obtain?
No EDTA was identified in that particular sample.
And was that blood refrigerated when you got it?
Yes. Well, we refrigerated it at the laboratory, yes.
And in fact, how long had it been refrigerated for?
Approximately 6 months.
So was it somewhat coagulated when you tested it?
Yes,
And did you found no EDTA?
that's correct.
Now, I think you indicated that you then began testing on this case on February 19th.
That's correct.
And when you began that testing, sir, can you tell us how you prepared the samples for testing?
I took cuttings of the samples, very small cuttings, maybe 2 by 2 millimeters, and placed those cuttings into a tube to be extracted. And then I also took the known samples of blood and placed, with the case of the one blood, placed it on the sock in a control area, and then placed the other blood on a control swatch that I had. Took similar cuttings from those and compared my results.
Now, you indicated earlier that there were, when you cut samples from the evidence, you made sure to cut them at least as large, if not larger, than you cut from the reference samples. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
Does the court have scissors?
Of course.
Would you please show the jury, I'm going to give you this Post-it and ask you to show the jury how you cut samples for your testing.
The size or how to manipulate scissors?
The size.
Hmm. That's not quite right. These are very large scissors,
What kind of scissors do you use?
a lot smaller.
Smaller ones?
Yeah, I can do it. This is actually a little bit larger than the stain I would have taken.
For the record, the witness has placed
Can I do?
that piece of paper that he cut onto this legal-size paper that I have. I'm going to tape it down so that it will be in evidence. But that's a little bit larger than the sizes you cut?
Right, just a little bit larger. Your Honor.
I wonder if this will show up on the Elmo.
It will, but you'll need a size reference.
Yeah.
Pencil,
Pencil?
pencil.
How long is it?
sir? This is just a relative demonstration, I assume.
Yeah. Looks really big now. All right, so the jury can see, actually, it's just a little larger. It looks like it extends just a little bit past the tip of the pen.
Well, it fits well within the lines of the paper.
Thank you, Your Honor. Have better measurement. All right, and you said that's larger than you cut?
Yes.
Now, when you indicated that you cut a larger piece of the evidence sample, or as large, but no smaller than the reference sample, what does that accomplish?
Well, that was to ensure that I got at least as much blood from the question samples as I did from the control.
And why is that important?
Well, it turns out that it really isn't that important because there is a dramatic difference between the blood with and without EDTA, but I just wanted to make sure that I had at least as much or more of the question sample.
And was that an effort to compensate for the issue raised earlier that if you have more sample, you'll have more EDTA?
That's correct.
Was that really of concern to you in this case?
Not really, because it's a dramatic difference between blood preserved with and without EDTA.
So any small variance would be easily compensated for by the cutting method you used
Yes,
and because of the dramatic differences.
that's correct.
I'm going to show you a graph. First of all, on the 19th, what you indicated, I think, on direct examination that you conducted the negative ion mode.
That's correct.
Now, why was it that you used the negative ion mode?
Well, I selected the negative ion mode because it's a very, very selective technique. Most chemicals will give a positive ion mass spectrum, but most will not give a negative ion mass spectrum. So I selected the negative ion because it's a lot more selective of a technique.
When you mean it's a lot more selective, sir, can you describe it? Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, probably one out of every 100 chemicals that I run will work much better on the negative ion than the positive ion. So its selectivity is 99 times greater than that of positive ion in that particular example. Most chemicals that I analyze will not give a negative ion response.
So that already discriminates to a large degree by weeding out those chemicals that will not react to the negative ion.
Exactly, that was my sole purpose.
And you already knew that EDTA would react with the negative ion?
Yes, I did.
And in this graph that we have here, I guess I've been asking to mark it as people's 543? 542. Thank you. All right, showing you, sir, People's 542 that's now up on the Elmo. On the far left of this graph, we have K67 and K68. What are those?
Those were the blood stains that I prepared from the known blood samples, one on the sock and the other on a piece of cotton or gauze.
I'm sorry?
They were the known samples that I prepared from the K67 and K68 blood samples.
And K67 and K68 refer to which parties?
Those were from Nicole and O.J. Simpson.
Now, what do those results indicate to you in terms of the parts per million shown?
Well, that's ion count there. It doesn't show anything about parts per million, but
Okay, ion count. And-
it clearly shows there's an abundance of ions for EDTA in both the K67 and K68 samples.
Now, to the right of that, we have Q206 and Q204. What are those?
Those were the samples that I had cut from the sock and the swatch from the gate post. And I treated those the same way I did the K67 and K68. And I analyzed them in a similar fashion and did not record any ions for EDTA.
And the one next to the very far right that says 100 ppm?
That is a standard I ran of 100 parts per million of EDTA, just to ensure that the instrument was working properly.
Okay, what do you mean when you say a standard?
That's a known EDTA sample that I took, put in solution at 100 parts per million.
And when you run something, a known quantity, on the mass spec, what does it help you to determine?
Well, it shows you that the instrument is working properly. That's the main reason that I used it here, just to show that the instrument was working properly.
Did it also indicate to you that you could detect an amount of 100 parts per million at least?
Yes.
Now, based on the testing you performed on the 19th, what was your conclusion with respect to the question that you were asked as to whether or not any of the evidence in this case, the blood on the gate and the sock, could have come from a preserved blood test tube containing ETTA?
There was a dramatic difference between the ion count, which I received on K67 and K68, and did not receive any ion count for the 204 and the 206. It's my opinion that the blood stains on Q406 and Q206 did not come from preserved blood, EDTA preserved blood, which is represented by K67 and K68.
And based then on the testing that you performed on February 19th, you had the answer, is that correct?
That is correct.
But you didn't stop testing,
No, I did not.
even though you had the answer.
That's correct.
You were shown the letter by counsel from Mr. Harmon in which he requested that you perform the testing.
That's correct.
In that letter, he pointed out to you the language which stated that you were being asked putting it up again on the Elmo. You were being asked to refute the possibility that the stain on this sock could have come from Nicole's reference sample. And the same thing with respect to the gate. Sir, did you take that to mean that we were demanding a particular result from you?
No, I did not.
Would it have mattered if you thought we had been?
No, it would not have.
You were going to perform the test you would perform in any event
That's correct.
and report the result that you got?
That's correct.
Did you take that to mean anything more than the prosecution's confidence that such items were not planted?
No, I did not.
And so when you went to conduct your test, did you go into it with any bias as to what you would or would not find?
No, I did not.
And did you have any allegiance either way towards what you would or would not find?
No, I did not.
Had you detected evidence that indicated to you that the blood on the rear gate and on the sock did indeed come from a preserved EDTA test tube, would you have reported those results?
Yes, I would have.
And would you have come in to testify to them?
Yes, I would have.
And is that what you found?
That is not what I found.
All right, record should reflect, counsel, that you're referring to page 2 of Defense Exhibit 1263.
Thank you. So after you completed your testing on the 19th and concluded that the blood was not from an EDTA preserved tube, you went on to do further testing.
That's correct.
And why was that?
Well, there had been a lot of talk about EDTA being a preservative and being in fabrics and being everywhere else, so I wanted to be thorough and just to see if I could detect any traces of EDTA whatsoever in blood stains.
And given what you've been telling us about the EDTA that's in soap and in detergent and in our food, did you have any opinion as to whether or not you thought trace amounts would be found in normal unpreserved blood?
Well, I mean, it's only logical to assume that if a person is eating EDTA, that some of it will be in their blood. The question is how much, and that's what I don't think anyone really knows today.
And with respect to the article referred to by Dr. Readers and by counsel today, the one from 1954, to your knowledge, that's the only one that does anything in the way of measuring EDTA in the body of a person, correct?
That particular case was a carbon-14 study, and they were able to inject EDTA, and they detected up to 30 parts per million in the blood.
And why did you find that article not to be helpful in terms of detecting what a normal level would be in someone's blood?
Because when they did the ingestion study, they only gave the subjects 1.5 milligrams, which is a lot lower than would be suspected or be consumed in the average diet.
I think you indicated on a direct examination that people would expect to eat roughly 50 to 100 milligrams a day of food containing EDTA, or
That-
EDTA in food.
That was in one of the reference articles that I provided, yes.
And this particular article from 1954, the study had the subjects eating only 1.5 milligrams orally.
That's correct.
And in that case, sir, you would expect to find much less in the blood than if they were eating or ingesting orally the amount that the studies have determined we actually do ingest, which is 50 to 100 milligrams. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, it would.
Was there any other problem with that article and its applicability to the experiments done in this case?
Only that it did have some conflicting information about the absorption of EDTA.
With respect to the absorption of EDTA, are there different types of salts used in different EDTA forms?
The FDA has authorized the use of 3 different forms of EDTA to be put into food. This particular study only addressed one of those forms of EDTA.
Now, what's the significance of that?
Well, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, but unless you test it, you don't know. I mean, in the body, they could all be converted to the same thing in the stomach. I don't know for sure how the absorption would change, but until the study is done, you just don't know.
And for that reason, in your opinion, sir, as an expert, would it be appropriate to rely on that article to base any calculations on the amount of EDTA you would expect to find in an average person on any particular day?
I would not use that study to try to determine that.
Nevertheless, based on the studies that have been done indicating we all eat 50 to 100 milligrams of EDTA a day, did you form the opinion that some trace amount of EDTA might be in everyone's blood on any given day?
In my opinion, there would be EDTA in everyone's blood.
Now, when I say trace amount, sir, if the substance detected on the rear gate and the sock is EDTA, which I understand you have not concluded, but if that is the case, would you quantify those as trace amounts,
They would be in the parts per million.
which qualifies for trace amount categorization?
Well, it depends on your definition, but a part per million to most people would be a trace.
And would that amount be consistent with what might be a normal level in someone?
Well, I don't think anybody knows, to be perfectly honest with you. It could be, but I don't have any factual information to say that it is or isn't. Only that in my blood, I saw the same indications. But you got to remember, I don't know that that is EDTA. I've not proved that.
In that regard, sir, did you find in looking at the results of your testing on the sock, the gate, and yourself, did you find certain consistencies in the readings and what the graphs demonstrated to you?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
As the one graph demonstrated, or some of them did, in my blood, the gate, and the sock, there's low levels of an ion that I look for with EDTA, very low levels compared to the EDTA preserved blood. I don't have the explanation as to what they're from. I believe they could be from other chemicals, it could be EDTA, or it could be some artifact in the instrument due to some type of matrix effect with the blood.
And in that regard, the fact that it could be another compound, sir, in your opinion, in order to rule out any other compound, as being the substance detected on the rear gate and the sock, would it be appropriate, in your opinion, to look at the Merck index for parent ions of a 292 weight?
Well, what I would not do with the Merck index is just look at compounds with a molecular weight of 292. In my experiments that I conducted, I did daughters of 293. So people may assume that what I'm looking for is all compounds with a molecular weight of 292, but that's not the case.
You know, I forgot to ask, what is the Merck index, sir?
The Merck index is a reference book of about 10,000 common chemicals that are used.
And does that index indicate for each of the compounds that it lists what the ions and what the ion count should be?
Well, no, it doesn't. What it does list, though, is the molecular weight of the compound. So it's a way that you can determine how many compounds are of a various molecular weight.
And is it referenced only by the parent ion?
Well, there's a lot of different references in the book. You can look up by molecular formula. Some of them you can look up by molecular weight. If you have the computer program, you can do a lot of searches.
Now, you indicated on direct examination that at some point this morning you received additional compounds of a similar molecular weight to the substances you found in the evidence on the rear gate and the sock.
Well, in the Merck index, I believe, molecular weight 292 and 293, there were probably approximately about 50 compounds that would give those molecular weights. But what you have to consider is there's probably multi-thousand compounds that have a higher molecular weight that you would also have to consider is giving the same results. Now, a compound with a lower molecular weight, unless something adds to it, you could pretty much eliminate. But just looking at the Merck index and looking at compounds at molecular weight 292 or 293, you can't eliminate all the compounds in the book with higher molecular weights that could give a similar response.
Well, how is that? If it has a higher molecular weight, how is it going to give a similar response to a 292 or 293?
Well, with the mass spectrometer, I'm only allowing that one mass to go through. Now, there's nothing to preclude a compound of a larger mass breaking down to 293 and then breaking down to the 162 or the 160 ion. That's very possible. And that's why I make sure that I do a full daughter spectrum before I ever identify a chemical in mass spectrometry.
When you say a full daughter spectrum, what do you mean by that?
Well, with EDTA, when you take the molecular weight or the molecular ion and you bombard it in the second quadrupole, it will fragment to ions. We talked earlier about some of those ions, or Dr. Reeders did yesterday, the 160 ion. Well, you also have a 132 ion, and some of the molecular ion passes through the quadrupole to 293, in this case, the quasi-molecular ion. And you not only want those three ions, but you want them in a certain ratio. In this particular case, the 160 is what's called the base peak. That's the largest ion. And then the 293 would be the second largest, and the 132. So we not only want all those ions before we identify, we want them in a particular ratio.
Now, scientifically speaking, sir, is it very important to insist that the whole spectrum be shown and in the appropriate ratio before you're willing to identify a particular compound in a court of law or anywhere?
In the chemistry unit, we pretty much require that if we're dealing with mass spectrometry alone. Now, there are other ways to identify chemicals, but if we're doing mass spectrometry, we want a full daughter spectrum. Unfortunately, mistakes have been made in other laboratories where they do single ion monitoring or look for just certain ions. It's a very dangerous practice.
And when you say a very dangerous practice, by that, sir, do you mean that you may identify a compound, for example, in this case, as EDTA, when it really isn't?
That's correct.
And in order to guard against that kind of error, is it important then to make sure that the full daughter spectrum is shown?
In my opinion, that is correct, yes.
Was the full daughter spectrum shown in the evidence of the rear gate, the sock, or your blood?
No, it was not.
Conversely, sir, was the full daughter spectrum shown in the reference samples from the defendant and Nicole Brown?
Yes, it was.
And for that reason, sir, In your opinion, is it scientifically correct or appropriate to identify the substance in the rear gate and the sock as EDTA in the absence of the full daughter spectrum?
In this particular case, it is not appropriate to identify EDTA based on the data that I have provided for the sock and the gate.
Now, having obtained the negative result for the sock and the gate on February 19th, you said you went on to conduct further testing on February 21st.
The 21st was pretty much to determine the minimum amount of stain I would have to use in order to detect EDTA.
And when you say that, tell us what you mean.
Well, what I did was I cut out some I put 5 microliters of blood onto a filter paper, and I divided that up so I took, which would be equivalent to 0.75 microliters of blood, 1.25 microliters of blood, and 2.5 microliters of blood. Then I extracted those samples, and I was able to detect the EDTA in all 3 samples. And in the one sample that was the smallest, I got the smallest ion count. The one in the middle, I got the middle ion count. And the largest sample that I cut, I got the largest ion count. And from that, I was able to determine that the minimum detectable amount of blood would be approximately 0.5 microliter of blood.
Half a microliter?
Yes.
How big a stain is that?
Well, it's probably a little bit larger than the tip of a pencil.
You want to break now?
Yes, let's take a brief recess. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a mid-afternoon break at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you, and we'll reconvene in about 10 or 15 minutes. All right?